This is the third lecture for Chapter 13, the cardiovascular system. And in this lecture, we're going to look at how the blood moves around in the body once it leaves the heart. So we've talked a little bit about the kinds of blood vessels in your body. Arteries are the vessels that attach to the heart and carry oxygenated blood away from the heart and to the rest of the body. Because the arteries are leaving the heart just after contraction, they tend to have the highest pressure of all of the blood vessels in your body. As the distance from the heart increases, so the further away from the heart you get, more towards, say, the hands or the legs, the arteries tend to branch into smaller vessels called arterioles. They're just smaller versions of arteries. The arteries and arterioles themselves have very predictable structures. They have three basic layers, and we're going to look from the inside out. So the innermost layer is called the tunica interna, or inner layer. It is made up of very simple cells called squamous cells. They're flat and they're smooth. It also has pretty good elasticity and some collagen fibers, which make the inside of the arteries and arterioles really smooth. It makes it easy for the blood to flow through them. The middle layer of the artery walls is called the tunica media. It just means middle layer. And it is a pretty thick layer of smooth muscle. So this is the same kind of muscle you find in your throat when you swallow, or your digestive tract, for example. And there's also really thick elastic tissue as well, which makes it possible for the arteries to expand when blood enters them and contract as the blood moves through. The final layer is the tunica externa, so the outer layer. This is a very thin layer as well, and it's primarily made up of connective tissue. That kind of allows the blood vessels to be anchored to the tissue around them. That way the blood vessels aren't shifting position and moving all over inside the body. It gives them a connection point and makes them more steady and stable. There are a few different factors that can affect the size of an artery. One of them is, so generally speaking, when the body needs to increase blood flow, that's a process we've talked about before called vasodilation, or increasing the blood vessel size. That might happen if the body's hot, for example, and we need to release heat. The blood vessels will increase in size so that more heat can be released through the skin. The opposite process is vasoconstriction, which is when the blood vessels get smaller, which slows down blood flow and reduces the amount of blood moving through at a given time. There are also some kind of changes that happen that cause problems. So an aneurysm, that's this word up here, aneurysm, occurs when the wall of an artery, usually, is damaged for some reason. The wall might be weakened because of just structural damage, or there can be infection or other things of that nature. And so when the wall of the vessel, if it's supposed to be this thick, say, but we get the wall and all of a sudden we've got one area that has almost no thickness right here, that as the blood is pushing through that vessel, the pressure repeatedly damages that weakened area, and it can eventually split open. Sorry, we've got a typo here that should say split. The vessel can split open, which causes blood to be released into the surrounding tissues. That can cause, if it's in your brain, that can cause damage to the brain cells around the artery. It can cause damage in other parts of the body as well. Brain aneurysms are obviously the most serious, because once brain tissue gets damaged by blood all around it, you can't really fix it. But what you need to remember is that as arteries become arterioles, the vessel gets smaller, and as the vessel gets smaller, the layers of the walls get thinner. Okay, so the thinnest vessel of all is called the capillaries. The capillaries are teeny tiny. They're about the thickness of a hair, or just slightly larger in some cases. And they have just a single layer wall, and that single layer is just one cell thick. In between that one cell, so if you think of the layers of a capillary wall being sort of like this, they have little openings periodically in the capillary wall. Maybe like that. There are these little openings in between the cells where materials can move in and out of the capillaries. The density of capillaries, or how many you find in a given area, depends on how much muscle activity and how much cellular respiration is happening in that region. So areas that have a lot of muscle, or organs like the liver, for example, that are doing a lot of work all the time in the body tend to have more capillaries. Areas with less of that, like for instance, the bones, your bones aren't really metabolizing all the time. So there are very few capillaries found in those regions. But the flow is regulated by little tiny muscles called precapillary sphincters. And these are also, you can see them in this picture down here. So just before an arteriole branches into a capillary, which is happening just below the arrow here, there are little muscles that are basically circular shaped, and they squeeze open, or squeeze closed or relax open the flow to the capillaries to increase blood flow or decrease blood flow, and therefore increase oxygen coming in and waste going out. So here's a picture where you can see some of the things that are moving in and out of capillaries. So in this picture, the blue represents just the water and other fluid that's in your body all the time. These, let me get a yellow color here. These yellow cells are tissue cells. So this would be body tissue, let's say maybe the muscles of the legs. And then this structure is the capillary itself. So the substances are moving through processes that we talked about early on in the school year. We talked about osmosis and diffusion and filtration. So the movement that's happening here is oxygen and nutrients, sugars and things like that, are moving from inside the capillary to outside to the tissue. Waste products and carbon dioxide are moving from the tissues into the capillaries. So good things are being delivered to the tissue, and bad things are being picked up by the capillaries. There are other things in the capillaries that don't leave. There's plasma, which is part of your blood that helps to regulate water and infectious cells that help fight infection. There are large proteins in there and hormones and things that just travel throughout the body until they're needed. Those are too large to fit through the little spaces in the capillaries, so they stay all the time inside the capillaries. So if this is the arteriole end of the capillary, so there's been a big artery here, and then that has branched into smaller arterioles, and then those arterioles are now branching into tiny little capillaries. The pressure, the blood pressure and the osmotic pressure is a lot higher at this end because the heart is back here, and so we've got good pressure coming, and it's pushing water, for example, out into the tissue if necessary. It's pushing oxygen out into the tissue. It's pushing foods, things like that. But as we get further and further away from the heart, that pressure gets lower and lower. And so at this end of the capillary, there's less pressure on the inside of the vessel than there is in the tissue. And so some of that water will come back in and help to make sure that there's an equilibrium, a balance between the area outside the capillary and the area inside the capillary. If there's too much fluid in the tissue, then a second set of vessels that are part of the lymphatic system will pick up that extra fluid and return it to the blood at a later location. Okay, so then this is our last vessel type. After the capillaries have delivered all of their oxygen and food and all of those things, so let's say we've got our little tiny capillary here, then the capillaries pour into larger vessels called venules. So the venules are headed back toward the heart. You'll find venules in locations fairly far from the heart, so feet and legs and hands and things like that. And then the venules eventually dump into really big veins like the vena cava, for example. The vena cava has an inferior, which comes from the lower part of the body, as you learned, and a superior, which brings back all the blood from the upper part of the body. Veins have the same three layers, the tunica interna, the tunica media, and the tunica externa. Same as the arteries, but veins have much, much, much less muscle. So if you look, this is our muscle layer, our tunica media on the arteries. You can see that it's really pretty thick here, but on the veins, that same layer, I'll highlight it and then erase it for you, that same layer is much, much, much thinner. That's because veins have much less blood pressure, and so they don't need to be as elastic because there's not as much pressure forcing the walls out and then rebounding them back in. Because the veins have less pressure, it's a lot harder for them to move blood. And the second challenge with the movement of blood in veins is that a lot of the veins, especially in the lower part of the body, are moving against the flow of gravity, right? So if this is your body, we'll make it like a gingerbread man, and blood is returning from the legs back up to the heart, it's going against gravity. That's a lot more work. And so there are some additional structures inside of veins, and you can see them here. There's a valve. There are valves all throughout veins that help to make sure that once the blood comes through this direction, then these valves close so that the blood can't fall back into the veins, fall back toward the feet, for example. Those valves close, which keeps pushing the blood back up toward the heart. So this is a review of one of the topics we've talked about in class. People have talked about what causes heart attacks and things. So atherosclerosis, this means hardening. Sclerosis means to harden. Athero means basically blood vessels. So this is the hardening of blood vessels because of cholesterol and plaque. So you can see this cholesterol build up here. It's a big chunky fat layer. And over time, as that layer attaches to the walls of the arteries and other vessels, you get blockage to the blood. The blood can't flow through here as well. And so eventually it causes blood clots. You get this big kind of log jam of blood cells right here. And that can cause the tissue at this end of the artery to die. That's a process called necrosis, or death of tissue. It can cause low blood flow, which means that the body can't work as well. The tissue can't work as well. That's called ischemia. We've talked about some of these causes already: poor diet, lack of exercise, tobacco use, family history even, obesity and high blood pressure. Some of the treatments there's a lot of medications now actually that can help break up cholesterol. We've talked about surgeries to go around the clot itself. That's called a bypass. There are surgeries we've talked about where you put a little kind of wand into the vessel with a balloon on the end, and then the balloon blows up and it blasts out that clot. So those are just